Okay, so the talk is mostly focused on, just as the previous speakers, on Lakatos's paper that appeared in the PSA in 1972, History of Science and its Rational Reconstruction. And I think what he did there was to propose, even though he didn't call it himself like that, a meta-philosophy of the philosophy of the history and the philosophy of science. I also think that actually it wasn't meant to be an account for historians. I think he's pretty clear that it's meant to be an account for philosophers of science. So he does say occasionally, he talks about historians, but he doesn't really engage in any way with historians' work, right? So that's really his main audience, philosophers. He's opposed to an aprioristic philosophy and against immutable scientific standards, and he does think that philosophy without history is empty. The leading question that he tries to answer in his paper is how can we assess and compare methodologies on the basis of the history of science, of course. And a common view is that, and that came out in the Otavu's remarks a little bit, that Lakatos really devalued the importance of the history of science for philosophical theorizing. And there's this famous footnote quote where he says that actually history doesn't, if it does not fit philosophical reconstructions, then it can be just put in the footnotes of philosophical papers. And there's also the concern of distorting history. For example, Kuhn writes in his paper, an interesting paper on notes on Lakatos. What Lakatos conceives as history is not history at all, but philosophy fabricating examples. Why is it that Lakatos feels the need to protect himself from real history? Why does he provide a parody in its place? He really didn't like that. And as Lowland, I object to the invention of historical figures and the fabrication of historical beliefs to score philosophical points or to teach philosophical lessons. So these are just a couple of samples. So here are the theses that I'm going to try to defend in this talk. So first of all, Lakatos' view and use, more specifically, or more importantly, of history is not as nearly as problematic as the common view has it. For Lakatos, the history of science is actually the arbiter of philosophical theories. Lakatos offers a viable view, and Lakatos' own account of science actually, if you take his methodology, comes out as more rational than Popper's, but not as more rational than Kuhn. So these are obviously steep theses, but I'm going to try to convince you of the correctness of them. So first of all, as background, so this is the structure of the talk. I'm going to introduce some of the basic components, which may not be necessary, but just for the just to be sure that we're on the same basis. Then I'm going to have a look at these accusations of devaluing history in more detail. Then I'm going to talk about what I think, so real Lakatos in some sense, the history, where he thinks that the history is the arbiter of methodologies. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the idea of maximizing rational history. And then I'm going to talk about what I call the phenomenon of falsified containment as a test case of methodologies, and I'm going to give you a conclusion. So first of all, rational reconstruction is really central, of course, for Lakatos, but he doesn't really define it anywhere in the paper. Of course, it goes back to Carnap, who meant something like concept explication. What Lakatos does say is that rational reconstruction is the rational explanation of the growth of objective knowledge. So roughly for Lakatos, rational reconstruction allows us to make rational sense of historical facts concerning theory appraisal. And through rational reconstruction, we get a better understanding of why certain scientific theories were accepted or rejected. Okay, so methodologies, so the basic components of his account are these methodologies, and he describes them in all kinds of ways. So he talks about theories of scientific rationality, demarcation criteria, definitions of science, logic of discovery. These are all the same thing. and I'm just going to call them methodologies here. Examples for methodologies that he talks about are inductivism, connectionalism, falsificationism, and his own methodology of scientific research programs. Then there's internal history, and internal history is just historical facts that you can make rational sense of in terms of whatever methodologies you hold, or whatever methodology you hold. He also describes it as primary history, and Kuhn actually raises the point, why did you actually call it rational history? And I think that's actually a good point. There would have been a better term, because the internal, external history, the distinction, and that's a criticism that Kuhn also makes, has really different meaning from the meaning that he imbues on it. And then there's external history, of course. So external history are all the historical facts, really, that you cannot make rational sense of, and that's left for the psychologists and the sociologists to somehow explain. In the background, is really I think the context distinction, context of discovery, context of justification. So he wasn't really interested in the context of discovery, just like Popper wasn't. And he also is pretty clear that what he calls the demarcation between internal and external history depends on the methodology. So if you reconstruct your history in terms of, say, deductivism, that's going to draw the line between internal, the particular line of between internal and external history. Okay. So the famous footnote quote is this: one way to indicate discrepancies between history and its rational reconstruction is to relate the internal history in the text and indicate the footnotes how actual history misbehaved in the light of its rational reconstruction. Again, that's one of the reasons why there was a lot of criticism of Lakatos' proposal. Lakatos actually disavowed the footnote statement. He later called it an unsuccessful joke. He said, I never said that this is the way in which history actually ought to be written, and I never wrote history in this way. And this, I'm not the first to make the point. I found it in Hacking's review already, and also more recently in Nemi's paper 2010. So I think he's right. He's right about the first part. He did say history ought to be written like that. So in the paper it says one way of writing history is like that. One way of indicating discrepancies is in this way. I'm not so sure about the second part. So he actually has a paper in the methodologies of research programs where he does have this footnote where he points out actually history is different from the way I presented you. Distortion of history, he does say that when we reconstruct internal history, we don't only select historical facts, we actually distort them. We may present a radically improved version, as he says, of the history. So that's of course super problematic as a general statement and as a general advice of doing history and philosophy of science. But I think if you look at the example that he talks about, that he mentions as the example, the example is not as nearly as problematic as that. So, for example, the example that he mentions is electron spin, which he presents as part of the Bohr's research program, even though Bohr never pointed the idea of electron spin. And he actually mentions that in the paper Lakatos, that he diverges here from the history. Holton was very upset, the historian, about this. He describes it as an ahistorical parody that makes one's hair stand on end. And there are actually other points that was also made by Kuhn in his reflections where he disagrees about the reconstruction. Other people have pointed to Braut's hypothesis as problematic. But certainly regarding the first point, it seems fairly innocuous, right? So if all you're doing when you're distorting the history here or presenting a radically improved version is just to give a certain name to a stretch of history where a certain theoretical idea was developed, then I think that's that's really quite unproblematic. And regarding Prout, it really concerns a small detail. And furthermore, one should also say that Lakatos didn't believe that philosophy was in the business of explaining the beliefs of individuals, right? So certainly regarding the first point, the Bohr model, yes, it didn't reflect Bohr's, theoretical beliefs about the Bohr model or how it could be developed further, but that's of no interest to Lakatos anyway. So the general advice again is problematic, but if you look at how he's actually doing his history, then I don't think, we need to be so concerned. Okay, so that brings us to the second part, the real Lakatos. In the paper he discusses, and that came up before, of course, two kinds of confrontation, as you might want to call it, between philosophical methodologies and historical facts. So in the first part, he uses falsifications as a meta-criterion. It's basically a comparing strategy. Go and try to falsify methodologies on the basis of history. If there's a mismatch between what the methodology tells you ought to expect and the historical facts, then you ought to falsify the methodology. But then Lakatos makes a very odd move. So he says, because my own account of methodology of scientific research programs is also falsified by facts, it has falsifiers. This is not a strategy I want to pursue any further. He makes a step to using his own account as a historiographical research program. In the previous talk that was described as 2 levels, so that would be the second level. And it's really supposed to mirror the lower level, the second level. You have hardcore, you have novel success, but I think it's very sketchy and not very convincing. What's less explicit, and maybe this gets more exciting now for you, is the idea of maximizing rational facts. So first of all, Lakatos thinks we should. So he talks about confronting, not literally confronting, but he talks about testing, just different word basically, methodologies with history. But then he also talks about these basic value judgments of the scientific elite. Basically, the idea is that the scientific elite tells us there's a good part of practice, there's a bad part of practice, and we should take that as evidence of our testing methodologies. And he claims this to be inspired by Popper and his analysis, his discussion of psychoanalysis versus Einstein's GTR, but he does not otherwise motivate this. But obvious reasons, I think, for introducing this idea is that it prima facie seems to be problematic to test norms against facts, right? You have this norm-fact divide. But value judgments are normative, right? It's a good part of practice, it's a bad part of practice. And basic value judgments, they seem independent from methodologies we're supposed to test. So these are 2 good things. A problem with that is that Lakatos doesn't really make any efforts to cite any actual scientific or scientists making these judgments. Actually, on the contrary, he just uses his own value judgments, it seems. So he implies that it was fine for Newtonians to reject classical mechanics because of to not immediately reject classical mechanics because of the advance of Mercury's period. And suppose we're really interested in these value judgments, I think there are a number of obstacles, even though they would have these nice properties. So first of all, it would seem that they're hard to access when they're made in the past, right? So maybe they're not recorded. We don't have access to them. If we're talking about current value judgments, then we run the risk of actually losing out on some important value judgment. For example, phlogiston was a scientific theory which had some success for some time, but then ceased to have success, right? So that seems to be general accepted view in philosophy of science, but that's maybe not something that scientists would give you if you would ask them, is that a good scientific theory? And there's also presumably a great diversity of value judgments among scientists. Okay, so I don't think so. Even though these value judgments they have these nice properties in the way that he describes them. I think that it's a good way to go. So if we focus on history as evidence for methodologies, what kind of history are we talking about? It can't be external history, right? Because that's by definition inconsistent with the methodologies of testing. External history is just the history that you can't reconstruct rationally with your methodology, so that can't be. If it's internal history, then the test procedure seems to be circular question begging, and that's the point made by Kuhn and made Muller. But I think the test procedure would only be circular. That's probably where I disagree maybe with previous speakers. If the methodologies determine historical facts. Because then there's no objective basis, right? And then you're bound to have confirmation of the methodologies. If that's not the case, then there's still this independence of evidence. So you might be selecting the historical facts in certain ways, but that alone, it's not guaranteed to give you success. The historical facts are one way or another. If you don't distort them, then that should be enough. Of course, there's going to be some bias still, right, if you have selection of facts on the basis of methodologies. But also that I think is not problematic. And here comes this idea of maximization of rational facts. And it's also not something that I take the credit for having first recognized that you find that in Kuhn already in 1918. So the basic idea is really the good methodology maximizes the facts that can be subsumed under internal history, and then minimize the facts that can be subsumed under external history. So if you have two methodologies, right, and one gives you a reconstruction of internal history that has that size, and all the rest is external, and you have another methodology that gives you that size of internal facts, and the rest is external, then, right, obviously this, on this account, is a better methodology than that one. And that allows us to make good sense of Lakatos's promise that methodologies can be criticized by criticizing the rational historical reconstructions to which they lead, and you have no singularity. Right? Because the way you're comparing is not by simply having a naive test, but rather you see how big the size of internal facts are that you're going to reconstruct the size of, or the set of rational facts. And bias is also problematic because, both of these methodologies, they can be biased, but you can still compare them, right, and say, this gives you more internal facts or more rational facts than this one does. Again, I said it's in Lakatos's paper, this idea is not very articulated, but I think this is as clear as it gets here in this passage. It says an impressive, sweeping, far-reaching external explanation is usually the hallmark of weak methodological substructure, and in turn, the hallmark of relatively weak internal history. Is that it leaves too much to be explained by external history. When a better rational theory, so again, that's just another word for methodology, is produced, internal history may expand and reclaim good ground from external history. Kind of lost track of time. How much? Is it 10 minutes? Or? 10 minutes, yeah. Okay. And something else that Lakatos says, which is interesting, I think, in particular when you think of the way some historians think of Lakatos, he actually was not naive about rational reconstruction. He made very clear that rational reconstruction has limits. So he says, the history of science is always richer than its rational reconstruction, and the reason for that is that no set of human judgments is completely rational and thus no rational reconstruction can ever concede with actual history. So okay, going back to the diagram, we're never going to have a situation where the internal history explains all the historical facts. Yes. Okay. So that's the last part here of the presentation. What I call falsifier containment. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, the example we mentioned already, the advice of Macquarie's perihelion did not result in the immediate rejection of Newtonian mechanics. It took Einstein to come along and present a better alternative theory that actually explained the phenomenon, right? So, in a sense, you could say the scientific community contains the falsifier, does not allow the counter evidence to falsify the theory. And that's an obvious problem for Popper's account, right? Because he, according to his falsificationism, you ought to reject the theory when it's being falsified, otherwise you're being unscientific. And that plays actually a central role, I think, in Lakatos' considerations. But it's not a problem for Lakatos himself, or for his methodology of scientific research programs. So as long as, so the pursuit of a research program is rational so long as it's progressive and produces novel success. Also the positive heuristic, he says, is more important for the development of a research program than anomalies. And he also rejects crucial experiments. And he concludes that what for the falsificationist looks like the regrettably frequent phenomena of irrational adherence to a refuted or to an inconsistent theory, so that's another point actually, and which he therefore relegates to external history, may well be explained in terms of my methodology internally as the rational defense of a promising research program. So you can clearly see that we thought of his own methodology as providing more, a better internal rational reconstruction than Popper did. It's interesting to note that actually the importance of falsifier containment was really impressed on Lakatos by Kuhn. So there's this precursor paper that Lakatos wrote that appeared in the Aristotelian, the proceedings of the Aristotelian Society, which then became this methodology of scientific research programs. The first section, he starts out with Popper versus Kuhn, and then the second, less later versions of Popper. You find elements of that in the 1970 paper, but it's less obvious. He also says in the 70 paper, he attributes to that paper to Kuhn the insight that falsificationism fails as a rational account of scientific growth. And again, that has to do with falsifier containment. And also, he describes as the main difference between Popper's falsificationism and his own account that criticism of theories does not and must not kill as fast as Popper imagines, right? So there again is this falsifier containment idea. And finally, I had the archivist here at the LSE extract me the even earlier version of the same paper, where he actually speaks of the Kuhnian thesis that theories are born refuted. He says if the theory is correct, then refutations play no dramatic role in science. The Popperian slogan makes sincere attempts to refute your theories falls flat if any new theory emerges in an ocean of current examples. So often this idea of theories are born refuted is associated with Lakatos, but he actually calls it the Kuhnian thesis here. So I think he really was impressed. So that, I think that really influenced his thinking a lot, his reading of the structure. Okay, 5 minutes. Just very briefly, maybe. So, Kuhn himself has two rationales for falsifier containment. I argued in a different paper. So one I call pragmatism. Is the idea if any and every failure to fit were ground for theory rejection, all theories ought to be rejected all the time, or all times, at all times. Right, so that's really something that Lakatos embraces, and there's also another one, efficiency, which I call efficiency. The scientist is supposed to examine every anomaly he notes will seldom get significant work done. So it's rational to continue your research when as long as the paradigm helps you solve other problems. That's maybe also contained in Lakatos, but maybe less explicitly. So the verdict here would be that Kuhn's account is actually, seems to come out at least as rational as Lakatos's. So Kuhn actually said that in his review, I've read no paper on scientific methods which expresses opinions so closely parallel in my own. So there's several analogies here by research program paradigm, which also appreciated by Lakatos himself. Degenerating research program and paradigm crisis. But Kuhn is also very frustrated that somehow Lakatos is not able to see these parallels. And actually, much of what Lakatos says about Kuhn is negative in the paper. For example, he says paradigm change is a mystical conversion, which cannot be governed by rules of reason. It's not particularly a rational cause for the appearance of a Kuhn crisis. Crisis is a psychological concept, something which he thought philosophers had no business dealing with. And he also calls it famously a matter for mob psychology. This is all rejected by Kuhn. So he points out that paradigm crisis is in fact very similar to degenerating research program. It's not just about the psychology, right? Paradigms in crisis are those which have experienced a number of anomalies, which raise doubts in scientists' mind that the paradigm is still a good paradigm to hold on to. Kuhn himself actually spoke of himself as trying to make a rational sense of science. He even spoke of rational reconstruction. And finally, theory choice for him is not determined by rules, but it's a matter of value judgment. And then he pointed out that actually Lakatos's account also contains a number of these value judgments. So, for example, when we want to give up a degenerating research program, there are value or judgments at least involved in doing that. And also, there is a further point which I'm not going to mention. So the verdict here really, I would say, is that Lakatos cannot claim that his account makes more rational sense of the history of science than Kuhn's, given his own historiographic account of HPS, I would say. Okay, here's the conclusion. So the footnote code and the radical improvement of history, I think, have been given too much weight in the previous discussion. Again, so he retracted the footnote code, partially at least. He didn't say much about the radical improvement, but I think the way he uses history actually is much less harmless than what his general claim would imply. Then there's this idea of maximizing rational history or internal history, which I think is a very useful concept. And Lakatos was not naive about rational reconstruction. He was fully aware of the limits of rationality. But again, given his own account, I think he comes out better. It's probably what he intended, but not better as contrary to what he argued. And I think really this idea of maximizing rational facts is a very useful one, which I think is also something that current HPS practitioners should strive towards. But one issue is, of course, maybe the construction of general methodologies of science is really out of fashion. So people don't like to think in these more, in these abstract or general terms about science, because the science is too diverse and so on. So for better or for worse, let us stand there.
Thank you.